Hi guys, welcome to my channel. In today's video, being that spring is finally here, I'm going to be testing out an idea I had for a watercolour painting of a rabbit using this water spray bottle. I'm going to be using my Schmincke watercolours in pans, and I've already pre-drawn an outline sketch on Arches cold press paper. So I'm used to using a spray bottle like this to pre-wet my watercolours before starting a painting, but what about using it to wet your paper? I thought I'd do a quick test in my sketchbook before trying it out on my drawing to see what sort of effects I could get. Now, in previous paintings I've often chosen to do smooth washes or gradients for backgrounds, but today I wanted to try out something a bit looser. The rabbit I'm painting is from a reference picture on Pixabay, and it's sitting in a beautiful green grassy meadow. As much as I love even washes, today I was aiming for a mixture of both blurry effects for my background, but with some sharp edges to the grasses in the foreground too. Using a spray bottle means you have less control over where the water goes on your paper, but it's easy and fun, and I really like the contrast in textures you get where the water isn't uniformly covering the paper. Now, as much as I said you have less control of where your water goes using this method, you can still preserve the white of your paper using masking fluid, so that's what I decided to do on the flower in the rabbit's mouth. With this dry, it was then time to spray on that water. I applied the water fairly generously, concentrating more on the areas either side of the rabbit, but being careful not to apply too much water as I didn't want big puddles. I went straight in with some May green paint and just dropped it onto the wet paper using a round brush. I really liked how in some areas where the paper was wet, the paint spread out, whilst in other areas where the paper was dry, the paint formed crisp edges. This may not be a look that appeals to everybody, but I thought it created a really nice effect for my grassy field. I also liked that I could add to the textured look by lifting up some of the watercolour whilst the paper was still wet. This I thought helped to add some light and interest to the piece as well. Then I continued with the second layer, which was a slightly darker sap green colour, and worked this into the foreground using more defined paint strokes to create the look of grass. Again, as the paper was still wet, some of these lines blurred and some kept crisper edges. I tried to vary the concentration of my watercolour to create a range of hues and add contrast. I also tried to leave some gaps free of paint and used the lifting method again to create some light spots. At this point I decided not to do any more for the background and started painting the rabbit, but as you'll see later on I did change my mind. For now though, and the painting of the rabbit, my aim was to really make him stand out and look realistic, but I wanted to continue to keep things fairly loose, so began by doing a light wash or underpainting first to establish areas of light and dark within the rabbit's fur. I used a really watery mix of gold brown and permanent carmine for the lighter areas and very dilute indigo for the shadow areas. I mainly worked wet into wet, but didn't worry too much about leaving any gaps in the washes, as this looser effect was what I was going for. Then I moved on to the rabbit's ears and used the same base colour as I did for the warmer fur colour. I started off around the edges as this area was darker in the reference photo, and added more water as I moved towards the inside of the ear where the colour was lighter. At this early stage I'm still only adding a first base layer to establish the general structure of the ear and get an idea of values, and will build on these colours later. I then used the same method for the second ear, although this one on the right is facing the other way. After I'd added a suggestion of where the darker shadow areas were going to be on the ears, I then began to build up the rabbit's face by darkening up his nose. I also added a first layer of cobalt blue and brown to the rabbit's eye. At this point I checked back with my reference picture and decided to build up the grass in the foreground again using sap green, but applying it wet on dry this time for a stronger, more defined look. And as much as I liked this, I still wasn't sure that the background was completely finished, so keep watching if you want to see what I did later on. For now though, it was time to go back and begin to build on those first light layers of watercolour, starting with the rabbit's ears. I used a mixture of burnt sienna and added in some quinacridone purple into the shadow areas using a very small round brush, and continued to build up the colour intensity on the paper whilst it was still wet, before finally lifting some of the colour out from the inner lighter area. I then worked the other ear in the same way and finished with a red-brown glaze over the whole ear on this side to change the overall colour up a bit. With that done, I wanted to add in some of the darkest colours on the rabbit, which would help me to work out the mid-tone values for the rest of the painting. So moving down at the back of the rabbit's head, I started to add in some of those mid-tones following the direction of the fur growth, and I also began to emphasise those darker areas of fur under the rabbit's neck. I tended to work in sections, adding in darker colours whilst the paint was still wet before moving on to the next area. I really enjoyed the process of pre-wetting areas at a time and dropping in different colours to watch them bleed and blend on the paper. Close up, you can see that I added in the darker tones wet on dry and then softened the edges just with some clean water. Whilst the area was still wet, this enabled me to then drop in different colours, so I used indigo and violets for the shadow areas, just following the lines of the fur growth. Then I turned my attentions back to the rabbit's eye, and this was one of my favourite parts. I used a pointed paintbrush just to apply some more definition to the outside lid of the eye, using dark sepia and indigo colours. I softened this just using a wet paintbrush to give a bleeding out effect, and added some quinacridone violet to the bottom eyelid to make it look a bit more realistic, before then going in and defining that lid again using a small amount of black. Adding in blues and purple colours to the eye really helps to make it look shiny. And as much as I didn't want to go too hyper realistic with this painting, I did make a bit of an exception for the eye, because that was going to be a real focal point for the piece. With the eye done and the darker parts on the ear in, it was easier to see what sort of values I needed to apply to the painting for the rest of the rabbit's face. I started to add in orangey brown tones to the rabbit's face and used short strokes in the direction of the fur growth to make it look semi-realistic. Using small fur strokes like this on top of those lighter layers, I think really helped to add depth to the fur, and I carried on using this method to build up the fur around the rest of the rabbit's face and neck. Moving on to the rabbit's body, and I decided to have a bit of fun with this part and try and mimic the effects of the spray bottle by adding water quite randomly and unevenly over the rabbit's back. I then went in with a mixture of browns and some purple and used more the side of my brush to get more of a scumbling effect. I liked how the colours mixed together on the wet paper, but also left a more textured effect on the drier parts. I gradually built up the fur colour and texture using darker layers and glazes, before adding in quite loosely the suggestion of some individual hairs with quite a dry brush. It was at this point that I decided to let the painting dry, and when I came back to it, as much as I was quite pleased with how it was looking, I did think it was lacking something, so I decided to go back in and do a bit more with the spray bottle to create a bit more depth and colour to the background. I didn't want water going onto the rabbit, so I just covered that up with some scrap paper and then went in with the same sap green that I used in the foreground. I dropped this in just using my same paintbrush, and then also decided to add in some darker permanent green to add some contrast. I did spend a bit of time thinking about whether the background would have looked better just white, but I've come to this new conclusion that if there's any doubt, then you should just go for it, because you'll learn more through having a go and experimenting than you will from wondering what might have happened. I I thought if I didn't like it I could also lift some of it out and take it back to the white of the paper or near enough, but I was glad I took that bravery step as I was quite pleased with how it looked. Having this darker background I thought helped to make the rabbit pop a bit more and also helped to show up those highlights around the rabbit's face and head. Where the darker area of paint met the lighter area that I'd done in the beginning, I just softened the edges using some clean fresh water before moving on to the other side. As I apply the darker paint next to the rabbit's neck on this side, you can see what I mean about making those highlights stand out. What I like about this spray bottle technique for applying backgrounds is that it's super easy and it really is lots of fun. You don't have to worry about anything being really even or smooth like you would if you're doing flat washes or gradients, and it really doesn't matter what happens. I think it all adds to the texture. You can also lift out areas like I did with this paper towel and get some really nice effects. I'm really glad I decided to be bold and try this out when I wasn't sure, as I really like how it turned out and I think it looks better than having just the white background that I had in the beginning. With this in place though, it then made me think that I needed to add some darker values to the foreground, and I added in a bit more grass using the wet on dry method and just then softened that at the bottom to increase the intensity with some more water. And when that was all dry, I then went in to add some darker values and contrast and a bit more of that fur texture to the rabbit's back. This watercolour painting was a lot of fun. I love the variety of colours, effects and textures you can get just using a simple water spray bottle, and I'd love to know if any of you have tried this technique in your watercolour paintings and what you use it for. I used it today to create a loose, easy background, but I've also seen artists use it for creating loose floral paintings, and it's definitely something I'd like to experiment with further. To finish off this painting, all that was left to do was to remove the masking fluid and fill in the flower that was in the rabbit's mouth using a size 0 round paintbrush. This was really nice to fill this bit in because it added another pop of colour to the painting. All that was left to do now was to add in some of the fine white whiskers and some of the white fur around the rabbit's face and neck, and I used Dr. P.H. Martin's bleedproof white for this. I have done a video on this channel about different ways to apply white whiskers and fur to your paintings, so I'll leave it in a card linked above in the top right hand corner of the screen. If you haven't got any of this, then you can use something like white gouache or white gel pen instead. I think adding this really helped to add a bit more contrast to the painting, and just with a few details it really helped to bring out those brighter areas of the rabbit's fur. So with this painting almost complete, the only thing left to do is give you my final thoughts on using the water spray bottle as a fun idea to loosen up your watercolour paintings, and I love it. I've been looking for something that's easy and helps me loosen up my watercolour paintings for some time now, and I really like the effects I got on today's painting. You can mix it up with more traditional ones, and even though it's not as easy to control as your flat washes, you can use it in combination with masking fluid if you want to preserve any white areas like I did for the flower. I hope you've enjoyed watching this painting today, and maybe it's inspired you or given you some ideas for paintings of your own. Let me know in the comments box, and as always, thank you so much for watching. I'll link above a few more videos you might like to check out, and look forward to seeing you in the next video. Take care everybody, thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon. Bye!